Ja, okay, jetzt zeichnen wir auf. Gut, ja, ich denke, dann sollten wir anfangen. Okay, so today it's a pleasure to have Christian Bayer here, and he's an economist from Bonn, and we have now a little bit some discussion on funding in the crisis, I think. And yeah, I just hand over to Christian.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Marcus. It's a great pleasure to give this talk. This is joint work, but I'm presenting with Benjamin Born from Frankfurt School, Ralf Lütticher from the University College London, and Gernot Müller from the University of Tübingen. What we do specifically in this paper I want to talk about is we look at the US coronavirus stimulus package and a specific part of it, and that's the transfers that the US government handed out to every taxpayer, and in particular to the unemployed. And there's now a very severe discussion of whether really these increased unemployment benefits should stop end of this month. It looks like they are about to stop. And yeah, and in this paper, we look at the macroeconomic consequences of the crisis, and in particular of these transfers and how they might help to make the crisis a little bit less bad. Okay, so let me start with something that many people know, of course, that is that the increase in unemployment that the coronavirus crisis, the Covid-19 pandemic has brought about in the US, but basically across all developed and developing economies is huge. It's in the sharpness, at least, that it had in the US, unprecedented. And the unemployment numbers are way larger than they were during the great financial crisis 10 years ago, a little bit more than 10 years ago. Okay, so like this is huge in terms of unemployment, in terms of the economic fallout that the pandemic has. And in this paper, we try to understand some specific aspects of this and what specifically can be done about it. But the crisis has not only seen an unprecedented increase in unemployment, but also in terms of fiscal stimulus. In particular, the US Congress had signed in March a $2 trillion fiscal stimulus package. That's 10% of US gross domestic product. In particular, this package has a very large transfer component. One component is what in this paper we call unconditional. It's not totally unconditional. Is a payment that went to the bottom 90% of all taxpayers in the second quarter of this year, and that was $1,200 to all taxpayers. So that's pretty big. In total, that was 250 billion US dollars, what was handed out as kind of an unconditional transfer to everyone. And then there was a big increase in unemployment benefits. And there was a top up of $600 US dollars per week, so 2,400 US dollars per month. And that lasted until the end of this month. Now, earmarked was for both packages 250 billion US dollars each. The first part was paid out. The second part, so that's a little bit more difficult. There were administrative issues in paying this out. So some of these transfers have not reached those people who were entitled to these increased benefits. So in fact, what has been paid out so far is less than the 215 billion US dollars. But if you just multiply the unemployment numbers with the 600 US dollars per week, you end up at something that's much larger than the 250 billion US dollars. Now, in our analysis, we set aside these administrative issues of this not being paid out, actually. But look at these transfers, these increased unemployment benefits, as if they actually would be paid out. So you could think of this as, had they done this right, how much would things have been better? Okay. So what we do in this paper, we try to understand the pandemic through the lens of what we call a quarantine type of shock. Okay, so we have a model that has a time resolution, it's this discrete time resolution of a month. So we can look at things over like every month. So the model kind of starts in March 2020, or it actually starts in February 2020. And then in March 2020, things start to move. Okay, and what happens is a fraction of people and capital actually is no longer able to produce. So the idea is that certain activities, certain types of activities that people do, but also capital goods are used for, say, think of the buildings of restaurants that restaurants use and so forth. They can simply no longer produce. This can be because the government tells them to do so, or it can be simply because, we all find it too risky to. To go to these places and to use them for economic activity. At the same time, we also model, and that's important, that a fraction of goods becomes no longer available. So certain types of goods or services are no longer available, again, either because the government tells you so, or because you all think that it's too risky to do this. Okay, so that's going to be important, and I'm going to talk about the two sides of this and what the effects are. And then we look at this from February 2020 on, and what we assume that is that people in February 2020, they know that this is going to happen. Okay, they realize, they wake up in February and they think, oh, shit, things in Italy are really bad. This is gonna also hit the US. So potentially, things gonna be bad. Okay, so they know about this shock, and then that they know that they have a certain likelihood of themselves being hit by this quarantine. What this does is it creates idiosyncratic risks for every household, because you don't know ex ante whether you in your activity are going to be locked down. Okay, so some people know that relatively early, relatively clearly, but you can think, for example, also of examples from the meatpacking industry where certain plants have been shut down, okay, because they had local outbreaks. So that's actually sort of literally a quarantine measure. And so you think that income has become more risky, and you do something about it, you save more. And that's bad for the aggregate economy, as we'll see. But at the same time, it also reduces simply expected incomes, okay? On average, there's less that's going to be produced, there's less income that is earned. And then the second bullet point that I had, that the fraction of goods that becomes unavailable, that creates a channel in which we quantify here that others have discussed in a more stylized framework, Guerrieri and her co-authors, that works through different goods, different services being imperfect substitutes for the goods and services that are lost. Okay, so the idea is that maybe you cannot no longer go to the stadium, and you can no longer go to the pub and have your beer there, but maybe then you just use a substitute and you still consume basically the same amount of, so the same value of consumption by doing other stuff more and in consuming other goods more. Okay, so instead of going to the pub, you have a beer more at home. Okay, so to some extent people do that, but then a lot of these activities, I mean, there is no good substitute. Okay, so what you then do is you think like, oh, I could have more activity in alternatives, which are no good substitutes, but then I'm in a sense just wasting my money. So what you'll do is you wait for better times when you can spend your money in a way that's more benevolent. I mean, that is better for you, that brings you more utility. Okay, so that's the idea, and we quantify this channel, and this channel is actually very important to understand the crisis. The channel that simply for the fraction of goods and services shut down, there is no close substitute, and so you wait until these activities come back. Okay. Yeah, so that's what we do. And to discuss this, we need a little bit of heavy machinery, because we want to discuss the effects of income risk and the effects of this extra insurance that the higher unemployment benefits give you. We need a model of incomplete markets. That is a model where you don't have insurance contracts for all eventualities available. Okay, so what this creates is the need to track the wealth distribution over time in this model. Because with that wealth distribution, then we will have differences in marginal consumption propensities out of income for different types of households. So we have a lot of heterogeneity in the model. And then we embed that in a medium scale general equilibrium model of the economy, which is sort of the standard tool that most central banks nowadays, I mean, these medium scale DSGE models that central banks use nowadays to understand the business cycle. Okay, so it's a standard business cycle model, which has on top this heterogeneity and this incomplete insurance. Okay, and then we feed our Q shock through the model and look at different scenarios where we have these transfers active or not active, and then compare how the business cycle goes. So what we find is that the Q shock, which is calibrated to the increase in unemployment, leads to a GDP drop by about 13% in the first year. So maybe like things are not that bad, but we'll see. But this is also for the situation where the US government doesn't step in to stabilize. A good 10% of this is caused by household income risk, and 3/4 of this, so the biggest part, is because of this consumption complementarities, or bad substitutes, if you want. Now, what we find is that transfers actually help to stabilize the economy quite a bit. In particular, the conditional transfers. Okay, so the conditional transfers, they have a multiplier that exceeds unity on impact. So for each dollar of transfer paid in this increase in unemployment benefits, you see more than $1 increase in GDP. And even in the long run, when sort of the effect fades out a little bit, depending on the stance of monetary policy, the multiplier is between 50%, so 50 cents for every dollar, or up to $1.5 for every dollar transfers. And so you need to think about this in a way that the society as a whole just shifts dollars from like one pocket to the other. Okay, so some people get poorer for sure, some people get richer in relative terms for sure, but it's not that through this transfer per se resources are wasted. It's not like digging holes in the ground and then filling them up again. Okay, this is just transferring resources. So having a positive multiplier at all already is something. To find that this exceeds 1, I mean, that's sort of a substantial good thing about this policy. The transfer multipliers are smaller that we find for the unconditional transfers that go to everyone. Key thing for this is that that we have this increase in income risk and this increase in unemployment benefits for those that are affected by this income risk. That is particular where the strength of this conditional transfers comes in. Okay, where they help particularly. And we also show that if there was a complete insurance against this quarantine shock among households already, this increase in transfers to those that get hit by the shock would basically have very little effect. Okay, so we are not the only paper, not the only group of people doing research on the COVID pandemic and the recession that follows. Sort of in economics, there's a huge literature I just read, I think this morning, that there were like 3,000 papers produced already. Now, on this slide, I have, I want to mention a few of those papers that are particularly relevant for what we do. Okay, so for the great financial crisis, the 2007-2008 crisis, there was, in particular, these 2 papers here that looked at the stimulus package. So they motivated us a bit to do this study here. There is a little bit of research on transfer multipliers, less than on government spending multipliers for like various reasons. One important reason is that to talk about transfers, you cannot work in sort of the standard setup that macroeconomists like to work with or liked to work with for decades. That's where there's complete insurance. And basically you can treat the economy as if there is only one representative agent or some few agents of different types. Okay, so to get transfers active, you need people that you take money away from and you need people to give the money to. And so at least you need 2 types of agents, and that's sort of some of the papers I mentioned here. They do this, they look at transfer multipliers in this setup. There is a study by Gechert and co-authors that look at this empirically, and they find also, like for German social security, they find transfer multipliers that are relatively high. So increase in insurance seems to work there also relatively well, sort of as a business cycle stabilizer. And then there is a literature that started some half-decade ago to become larger, and that's this heterogeneous agent models of the business cycle. So they are heterogeneous agent new Keynesian models, therefore called Hank models. And they are particularly well suited to discuss these channels of insurance and transfers for the business cycle. Okay, mostly they have been applied to study monetary policy and transfer and fiscal policy in terms of government spending. But there is this literature and we built on that. Okay, and then there is this 3,000 papers in economics on the pandemics, and I pick out a few here, which are kind of macro papers, macroeconomic papers. In particular, the Gregarian course is one that I mentioned, which discuss this channel of some varieties, some types of goods and services disappear. What will you do? Will you start to spend them on others? I mean, spend what you typically spend on these goods and services. Will you spend that on other stuff? Or will that go into increased savings? And so they highlight that this channel can be active. And here in our calibration is actually very, very active and very important to understand the pandemic. And then there is other papers like the Eichenbaum and co-authors paper that looks at the interaction of economic activity and how the pandemic evolves. That's something that we just disregard. Okay, we just treat the pandemic entirely exogenous. So we don't have a model here where you have a business cycle model that is linked to, say, an SIR model or an SIER model. Okay, we don't do that. Others have done it. This is for sure very interesting to see what comes out of this. And there is very nice research that argues that actually sort of government lockdown measures can actually be not very harmful, because if the government doesn't do them, then at some point when the pandemic gets sufficiently out of hand, people will do that by themselves. Okay, they would just stop going to restaurants, and we do see that for example, I just saw that data today, that there is this research that compares, say, how many people, I mean, like you take these numbers from Open Table and you see like how much are the numbers of reservations down, say, in the US, and you compare them, say, to Germany, and you see the infection numbers are low in Germany and people start going back to the restaurants, whereas in the US they don't. Okay, so and that's not because the government locks them down, because we like mostly there is no government measures in place in both places. Okay, so we disregard this for this paper. Others have looked at it. It's for sure very interesting. If you find time, have a look at that. Okay, so let me give you an overview of the model and then try to get to results. And I decided to be very informal here, given the interdisciplinary setup of this group. Okay, so we have as I said, a standard business cycle model, and in general, which has three sectors: a household sector, a production sector, and a government sector. The government sector has two authorities: a monetary authority and a fiscal authority. The monetary authority sets the nominal interest rate using a Taylor rule. That is, there is a simple, it's described as if there's sort of a simple mechanism that the government observes the inflation rate, and then based on that, it sets a nominal interest rate. Okay, and if the inflation rate goes up by 1%, the interest rate goes up by roughly 2%, I think, if I recall our calibration correctly. Okay, and then there is a fiscal authority, and that fiscal authority issues government debt. It consumes goods, it taxes labor income and profits, and the consumption of goods by the government is governed by, again, a simple rule. There's no maximizing or any sophisticated behavior here on the side of the government. It just sort of does business as normal, except for this transfer package that we look at. Okay, so it based on the amount of outstanding debt, it decides how much to spend and how much to tax. The production sector has sort of a lower level, which is firms that combine capital and labor, and they produce some intermediate goods. There is a competitive market for these goods such that capital and labor, so wages and rental rates for capital, they result as like from this competitive market as the marginal product, so what they contribute to production. But then there are some households don't buy these intermediate goods. They buy final goods from entrepreneurs, which are monopolistic resellers. Okay, and so they charge a markup on the price that they pay for these intermediate goods, and that markup would be constant if there were no adjustment costs to prices. So these entrepreneurs, they cannot adjust prices easily every period, so they have a time varying markup. And they also produce capital goods. Okay, for this reason that they charge a markup, they obtain profits. And then some of these goods of these monopolistic resellers in the crisis, they disappear. Okay, so that's this channel of disappearing goods and services. Households, they do two things or three things. They obtain income as wage income. There is some idiosyncratic risk for their productivity, and they have this quarantine risk. There's some union in the background that is similar to this price adjustment costs here. So that gives us some stickiness in wages, so they don't just jump around so easily. So that's for empirical realism. They obtain interest on bonds that they own. Bonds are mostly government bonds. Okay, there's some inside bonds from the household sector. They obtain dividends from the capital that they own, which is the marginal product of capital. Okay, so what capital on the margin produces. And here there is a liquid rental market. And then some of the households become entrepreneurs and they get a share of the entrepreneurial income here. Now, households can insure themselves a little bit because they can trade some assets. They can trade a bond, which is mostly the government bond, but they also can borrow. So they can also produce some bonds themselves. This is liquid. They can trade this every period. And then there is an illiquid asset, capital, which they cannot trade every period. Think of a house. Okay, big chunk of capital, biggest chunk on a household balance sheet, and you cannot easily trade it every period. Okay, so we model this as stochastic participation. Once in a while, households can participate in that asset market for illiquid assets. They can always rent out the capital good that they have, but they cannot sell it every period. So what does this do? It is important to create a reasonable distribution of marginal propensities to consume for our households. Because if you look just at the wealth distribution in the economy, there is a lot of households that have substantial amount of wealth. But if you dig a little bit deeper, a lot of them have very little liquid wealth. Most of them only have illiquid wealth, a house, and specific, in particular for the that's true for the U.S. economy. Okay, and so you would overestimate the capacity of households to insure against this coronavirus shock. If you just think that all their wealth they can use to smooth out the shock to income and keep their consumption stable. Okay, so that's why we have this two asset structure here. Okay, so then we bring the model a little bit to the data, calibrate it such that it reflects relatively well the US wealth distribution, both in terms of inequality and in terms of the aggregate capital stock that you have in the economy, a bunch of standard parameters for the utility function, production function, yes, portfolio adjustment probabilities. This is the monthly probability is 5.5%. So that's a relatively high probability to be able over a year to adjust your portfolio and sell, say, if you think of this as your house. The substantial labor income risk. There is in the steady state or the stationary equilibrium a very small risk to go into quarantine because we need to have that state there in principle, because then we solve the model by first order perturbation around the stationary equilibrium. Yeah, the government. So there is a relatively mild markup of 10%, but there is a relatively low elasticity of substitution between sectors. So the way we model these goods and services to disappear is that the certain sector shuts down. Okay, so you cannot easily substitute. And in particular, the elasticity of substitution between these sectors is lower than the intertemporal elasticity of substitution that we have. And that's sort of important for this channel to be very strong. Yeah, government is mostly standard. Yeah, taxes are relatively smooth, spendings are relatively smooth. Monetary policy increases in the long run, increases the nominal interest rate by 1.5% if the inflation rate goes up by 1%, and smoothes the response over time. So this is our standard setup here. Then we have one alternative, but I'm kind of running out of time, I guess. So we linearize the model around the stationary equilibrium. So all the in the microstructure, all the risk is still there. In terms of macro, risk is unimportant. Okay, so we look at this quarantine shock which hits both workers, capital, and varieties. It's mildly persistent. So, I mean, this is on a monthly basis. And the incidence to go into quarantine for a worker that's low in the income distribution is, as it is empirically, higher in the model than for high income workers. And then we have we match the inflows into quarantine by the initial UI claims, unemployment insurance claims in February, March, and April, and then that's the shocks that we look at, because that was the data available when we wrote this before going into vacation. Okay, so that's the inflows, that's the stocks. You see there's a big increase in unemployment, and then sort of our predicted path is that sort of by December, unemployment is still higher, but it's only 4 percentage points higher than normal. Okay, so here is what happens without the government intervening. Month 0 is February. So in July, so that's the kind of the trough in output, in consumption, and in investment. Okay, so this is all for just one wave of quarantine. This is what, if the government does nothing, is pretty severe. Now, if the government, let me skip this. No, I talked about this transfers. If the government puts them on, that's what the government did, but this is sort of our ideal world here a little bit. We see that there is, the trough is substantially weaker, okay? So there is a good 5 percentage points that's shaven off the trough in output and in consumption, and also investment is much stronger relative to the baseline. Now, we can do this separately for the two parts. If we don't have any transfers, that's the blue solid line. If we don't have the unconditional transfers, if we don't have the conditional transfers, that's the green dash dotted line. And if we don't have the unconditional transfers, that's the black dashed line. Okay, so what you see is that the biggest part here is coming from the unconditional transfers. And this gives us these high multipliers. That's how much does GDP cumulatively over time go up for every dollar spent in transfers. And you see, so in the long run, they're around like 70 cents. And initially, they're substantially above 1. Okay, so because the package has already in effect, if it was in place, so that's the way we look at it. If it was in place in February, it would have had already an effect in February because people expect it. So that's, and there's nothing spent, so the multiplier there is infinite, of course. So that's why we start in month 3. Okay, if there's no uncertainty, kind of the picture reverses. so clearly what helps here is this extra insurance. Okay, this $600, they worked through creating extra insurance without any uncertainty. It's the unconditional part that is much stronger than the conditional one. And this is, so the right panel here is telling you that the multipliers are relatively unaffected from by the fact how we model this lockdown for goods. If there's no lockdown for goods, so that's the extreme alternative assumption, the multipliers are pretty much the same. Okay, so then we can look at also asset markets. So you see here the blue line is what happens without the package. Inflation rates remain, I mean, they shrink slightly. And so the nominal rate shrinks slightly. And then sort of next year, we would see a pickup of inflation. With the package, like our model suggests that we should see a mild pickup of inflation already this year. Let me skip this. Interestingly, also the model can talk about inequality. So how the pandemics affects different strata of the population differently. So the way we look at this is through Gini coefficients. And what you see without the transfers, the income Gini goes up quite a bit. Okay, so it's a 20% increase in the income Gini. That's a strong increase in the income Gini. Because some people just lose most of their income because they can no longer work. With the extra insurance, the income Gini's response is much milder. Consumption inequality actually goes down a little bit, but then over time goes up, and wealth inequality goes down substantially over time, and this is because government debt has increased. And the increase in government debt helps the poor to accumulate wealth more easily because it increases real interest rates. So that's it. What we did in the paper is to look at the economic fallout of the COVID-19 crisis through the lens of this quarantine shock. Okay, where a part of the economy shuts down, workers, capital, and goods. We focus on transfers and on income risks, and the increase in income risk is huge, and this makes transfers a relatively strong way to stabilize the economy. In particular, if these transfers are targeted to those people that are hit in particular hard by the pandemic shock.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for this very nice talk, Christian. So we would really like to applaud. Yeah, so I would like to open the discussion. You can use again your little hand you have available in Zoom, but you can also, of course, switch on your microphones now, if you like. I would like to start the discussion by asking about the inequality again. So in your, as far as I understood, in your original form, the model was based on mean data, so you had this one table with a household parameters, and they were given by means of the, I think, I don't know exactly, but well, in any case, it doesn't matter. So what I don't understand is how you can introduce then the Gini factor. Is it a kind of deviation from these means? So yeah, exactly. So here you have Yeah, no, the next one. Ah, no, wait.
I think it should be that. It should be that table.
Yeah, it should be there. Yeah, right.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So we model, so we calibrate the model in order to match the U.S. wealth distribution.
Yeah.
We don't actually calibrate on the Gini coefficients.
Right.
Like the income risk that we feed in is coming from U.S. income distributional data. So the model matches the income Gini well, and as far as I remember, we also match reasonably well the consumption Gini. Okay, that's basically it's a non-targeted moment of the model, but we match it reasonably well. So but this class of models is known to be able to generate reasonable consumption data. So here, concretely, we match only the top 10% wealth share. But with that, that's an important factor in the wealth Gini. Okay, so for that reason, we also match the wealth Gini reasonably well. And then what we look at in the simulation over time is, as you said, deviations from that wealth Gini. What the model has is it keeps track of the wealth and income, joint distribution of wealth and income over time. Okay, so the model is in the end, it's a difference equation, a very large set of difference equations, but it's function valued. Okay, so there are these wealth distributions, and the value functions from the Bellman equation are the two function valued elements of the difference equation. And so this is tracked over time. Now, of course, we need to do something about the dimensionality to be actually able to solve this. But that's what we do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that answers it very well. So I would like, I think David was first.
Yeah, you sort of answered a little bit my question. That was so the mathematical framework of your model are time discrete equations, right?
Yes.
And what is the lag? So the time. So it's like 1 month.
It's a month. It's a month.
It's a month. Okay.
Okay, then I think Heike was next.
Not really, but I can. But I have a question. Do you assume that all your macroeconomical, I'm an ecologist, a macroecologist, by the way. So all your macroeconomical dynamics is based on behavior, as far as I understand it. So
yes.
And you assume that people change their behavior due to the situation. Do you assume that they go completely back when the shock is over, when the crisis is over, or would they go to another equilibrium maybe?
No. So the model has we haven't proved it, but I think the model has a unique equilibrium. And so the way this is done is the economy returns to this equilibrium again over time. So yes, so that's something we abstract from. Okay, so there's but I think in terms of the business cycle part, I mean, there might be a disruption that might create a longer like adjustment like with the recession. If you think of the airline industry or so, people might change their behavior. But a lot of what is going on is and we see that is like very, very short-termish reaction to the pandemic. Okay, so people mostly don't fly because of the pandemic, not because they think now that, like, for other reasons flying is bad, or they don't go to the pub because of the pandemic and not because they don't like to drink anymore. And so that's our take on this. Of course, this is a simplification, but I mean, you need to simplify somewhere.
So there isn't any kind of learning, because I could imagine that at least for the upper third in your wealth distribution, some people might have experienced that they could live also differently. So I'm speaking of myself now. So I realize I can live without flying and without going lots of times to the restaurant. So life is a nice life too. Okay, but that's just a remark. And this would complicate your model probably very much.
No, sure. If we would have changes in preferences, I mean, that would require a totally different approach, I think. Then we would need to think about industry structures that need to adapt. That might require actual resources to change the industry structures, to turn pilots into, I don't know what, civil engineers. So yes, that's all.
Okay.
It's all set aside.
Could I come back to this inequality question, because it really interests me? So you parameterized your model now with the US parameters. So if you would have, let's say, two extreme other countries, other cases, one where there is more, where there is a peak at the very poor side, and then let's say the other country is which would be somehow close to the US, peak more to the rich side in the wealth distribution. What would you expect for these quotients? So if the government spends money, would it be more effective in this country one, in the poor country, or would it be more effective in the rich country? What would you think, or does it not matter?
No, so the wealth distribution matters big time, and what matters also big time is the insurance institutions in place already in the economy. Okay, so the US economy has some unemployment benefits, so that's something, and they are universal. I mean, relatively universal, not for freelancers. That's a particular issue in this crisis. But and that's also one of the motivations of this unconditional transfer. But other economies have more generous unemployment insurance systems, and yet other economies don't have universal unemployment insurance. Okay, if you look at Southern European economies, going into the crisis, a lot of them didn't have universal unemployment insurance. Okay, so what you'd expect is that this crisis is worse in those countries that have weaker unemployment insurance.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's sort of a key thing. Then the wealth distribution, well, if an economy has a wealth distribution where a lot of people have quite substantial liquid assets available, they don't need to cut back as much on consumption through this precautionary channel. Well, the crisis is still going to be very bad because they're going to cut back on consumption because they don't go to the stadium, to the pub, and whatever. Because that's simply, in a sense, not available, and then you don't spend it on other stuff. That's just not a good substitute.
Yeah. Thank you. That, but you wouldn't be able to know, just by now how these coefficients would change. This you haven't investigated.
No, we haven't. I mean, to be honest, we haven't calibrated the model to another economy and to look at what things do. In a sense, you can think of this $600 US top up as a very, very generous unemployment insurance system. Okay, because you get replacement rates of way above 100% for a large part of the population. Actually, with this $600 top up. But Luca also had a question, I think.
Well, my question is related to how modeling, how in the model is included, or if it is included, the effect and the action of the government with respect to the health system. Month after month, of course, the government is not only providing money to the population, but also acting.
As I said before, our exercise is very limited in the sense that we take the view that we as economists do understand too little of this, and so we just let the pandemic go through the model in terms of this Q shock wave, and that's it. That's the only thing that we have. Now it's like other people have done this a little bit more interdisciplinary and have taken different approaches, but in the short time since the beginning of the crisis, we couldn't. So we thought it's better to limit ourselves to what we know than talk about stuff that other people have thought about for years and we don't understand sufficiently well within a few weeks.
Okay, is there any other question? I don't see a hand, but well, okay, well, if not, then we would like to thank Christian again. It was very interesting. So thanks a lot, Christian.
Thanks for having me.
And then I wish everybody a good evening, and we come back here then next Thursday. Thanks a lot, and have a good holiday, Christian.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.